My name is Karen Engel, and I'm a professor here at the law school and co-direct with Neville Hode, the Bernard and Audrey Rappaport Center for Human Rights and Justice and the Sissy Farenthold Fund for Peace and Social Justice. The center and fund are an interdisciplinary center at UT at the intersection of academics and advocacy. And I think this event will fit in. It will fit in very, very well with the kind of work we do focused on peace, social justice, environmental justice, reproductive justice, and the intersection of all of those things. It's my great honor to welcome Dr. Ira Helfand, who I thought you came from Massachusetts, but you said you came in from Philadelphia? Okay. To present the quote, "The Growing Danger of Nuclear War, What We Must Do to Prevent It." It's just a small topic he's going to touch on tonight. He is a physician who has long been working to document the potential dangers of nuclear war and has been instrumental in the founding of 3 organizations aiming to ensure it doesn't happen, 2 of which have received the Nobel Peace Prize. And before I give him a proper introduction, because that was just a taste, I want to say thank you to the Rappaport Center staff for organizing this event. So Cooper Christiancy, who I think just went out, there he is, Maya Borchardt, and Brianna Silva. And I also want to thank Roxanne Elder for working with us on the series that this talk is a part of, Sissy at 100, which I'll tell you more about in a moment, and on helping make Ira's visit here a success, including by getting him, working with him on, or working with the Austin American-Statesman on a publication of an op-ed today. And so if there are any students here, this is what looks like a newspaper, but actually it's not, it's a printout of a newspaper. So anyway, hopefully you'll have a chance to read it. So Dr. Ira Helfand is a member of the International Steering Group of the International Campaign to Abolish Nuclear Weapons, or ICAN, which received the 2017 Nobel Peace Prize, and is past president of the International Physicians for the Prevention of Nuclear War, and I don't know, in case it comes up, it's IPPNW. And that received the 1985 Nobel Peace Prize. He's also co-founder and past president of Physicians for Social Responsibility and a member of the steering committee of Back from the Brink. And I know some of you are here from there, and welcome to you all as well. Dr. Helfand has not only published in the Austin American-Statesman, but actually he's published quite widely, including in the New England Journal of Medicine, the Lancet, the British Medical Journal, and the World Medical Journal, on the health consequences of nuclear war. He's been involved in anti-nuclear work at the UN as well, chairing the session on the humanitarian impact of nuclear weapons at the UN Open-Ended Working Group in 2016, which led to the successful negotiation of the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons. Now, his talk today is presented by, as I said, the Rappaport Center, and as part of the Sissy Farenthold Fund's Sissy at 100 campaign, which is a year-long celebration of what would have been the 100th birthday of Texas trailblazer and global citizen Sissy Farenthold. And just to say a word about that, we're bringing in speakers over the course of the year that are relevant to some part of Sissy's decades-long work for social justice and peace, from her time in the Texas legislature in the late 1960s and early 70s, through to many grassroots campaigns that she was involved with until her passing in 2021. I'd be shocked if she and Dr. Helfand have not been in the same room, given her long involvement in anti-nuclear work, including with the Bulletin of Atomic Scientists. And I actually found you both mentioned in the same issue of the Bulletin. In the mid-1980s, she was very involved with Women for a Meaningful Summit, which was an ad hoc group of women who came together to exert, through what some participants called private diplomacy, a direct impact on the Cold War summits between President Ronald Reagan and General Secretary Mikhail Gorbachev. So you all have, I think, in front of you a card, a postcard, something that looks like a postcard, which is for the Sissy for at 100 series of events, and there's a stamp that goes with each one. So everyone has a stamp? No, the stamps are being passed out now. Yeah? And the reason I'm mentioning this now is because the stamp has a sign that has two people holding a U.S. Citizens for the Test Ban sign, and that's actually Sissy and her cousin Jen Vaughn at the summit in Reykjavik, where they attended as part of Women for a Meaningful Summit. And really, this is a test because you'll have that stamp and you can put it on that postcard, but it's going to take you the entire time that Dr. Helfand is talking to us for you to get the back off. So good luck on that. But all to say, I think this is a fitting tribute to Sissy, but it's like so important for us to have you here today, Dr. Helfand, maybe more than ever, so welcome.
Well, thank you very much, and thanks to the Rappaport Center for inviting me. And it's just a real honor to be here as part of a program honoring Sissy Farenthold, who is a legend not just in Texas, but really throughout the peace movement. I also want to thank all of you for coming tonight. I suspect that given the announced topic, you're all aware this is going to be a fairly difficult conversation we're going to have this evening. I think it's a conversation, though, that we need to have. I used to apologize when I would give a talk about all the horrible things I was going to tell people. And, I've just come to believe in recent years that we have basically two choices. We can talk about nuclear war, and we can do something to prevent it, or we're going to have one, which is going to be a whole lot worse even than talking about it. So I think there are basically three messages that we need to bring to the general public at this point. One is that nuclear war really can happen. This is not just some 1980s thing that we read about in history books. It's a real danger today. Secondly, that if it does happen, it's going to be far worse than we can possibly imagine. And third, and perhaps most important, it doesn't have to happen. This is really a choice that we face as a nation, as a society, as a global civilization. So let me go through those points one by one. First, in terms of the actual threat that this could happen, back in the 1980s when Sissy was very active, everybody understood this. I mean, there were millions of people in this country who became politically active around the need to prevent nuclear war. And our culture was pervaded with it. There were books about nuclear war. There were movies like The Day After and Threads and war games about nuclear war. People had nightmares about nuclear war. If you ask people in a poll, what are the most important problems facing the world today? Preventing nuclear war was number one and number two on everybody's list. It was just a huge part of our life. And that was good, because as a result of that, we all became active. And that activity was incredibly important in, it stopped the Cold War. We'll talk about that a little bit more later on. The problem was that in 1990, when the Cold War ended, the world collectively began to act as though this problem had gone away. And it certainly was somewhat better. In the 1990s were a safer time than the 1980s had been. The Cold War was over. We all felt this tremendous sense of relief. We dodged the bullet. There wasn't going to be a nuclear war. The problem is the problem hadn't gone away. There were still tens of thousands of nuclear warheads. And even though things were better in terms of tension between the great powers during the 90s, the weapons were just sitting there, basically, waiting for something to go wrong again. And things have gone spectacularly wrong over the last 10 years. We were warned in 2018 by William Perry, the former Secretary of Defense, that then, in 2018, the danger of nuclear war was greater than it had ever been, worse than at the worst moment in the Cold War. And he was talking primarily in the context of U.S.-Russian relations. And given that, it's really important to remember that this was 4 years before the second Russian invasion of Ukraine, which has made the situation between the U.S. and Russia that much more dangerous. especially with the flood of very explicit nuclear threats that have flowed out of the Kremlin since 2022. But U.S.-Russian relations aren't the only problem. U.S.-Chinese relations are the worst they have been since the 1970s. We are in the middle of a trade war with China. There's a very real possibility that we could find ourselves in a military conflict with China over Taiwan, over navigation in the Taiwan Straits. The situation in Korea is as dangerous as it has ever been. Probably everybody here remembers 2017, how worried we were then with the threats being tossed back and forth between Kim and President Trump during his first term, arguing over who had the bigger button and who was going to do what to whom in fire and fury. It was a very terrifying moment. In 2018, they had the two summits in Hanoi and Singapore, and I think people felt, oh, okay, this problem's been dealt with. It wasn't. Those summits were a complete failure, and Kim walked away from them convinced that the U.S. could not be negotiated with, and determined to build a nuclear arsenal and the missiles to deliver those weapons. And that's just what he's done. And now, South Korea, faced with the very tepid U.S. support under Trump for Ukraine, has come to the conclusion that they need their own nuclear arsenal. And they haven't made that decision, but there is a widespread public support in South Korea now for South Korea to develop its own nuclear weapons. Incredibly dangerous, tense situation there. There's a situation in the Middle East, obviously, which we're seeing play out in real time this week. Because Iran does not yet have nuclear weapons, the chance of a nuclear war there is, at least directly arising from the conflict, is perhaps less. But this is such a totally unpredictable situation. We have no idea how far this conflict will escalate. And two of the countries involved in it, Israel and the United States, are major nuclear powers. And finally, there's the situation in South Asia, which I actually think is the most dangerous of all. India and Pakistan have gone to war 4 times since independence in the 1940s. They fought a mini war just last May, lasted for 3 days. During that war, the Indian Air Force at one point was bombing Pakistani military bases where nuclear weapons were stored. This could easily have escalated into a war in South Asia, which would have been a catastrophe not just for South Asia, but for the entire planet, as we'll talk about. So 5 geopolitical flashpoints, any one of which could lead to nuclear war, and all of which are essentially unstable at this point. In addition to these geopolitical flashpoints, there are several other factors that we need to consider. One is the role played by the climate crisis. And I think there's an inadequate understanding within the climate movement, within the environmental movement, of the close relationship between these two existential threats. Bill McKibben, the very eminent climate activist, has said that he thinks the way the climate crisis is going to play out, the way it's going to do us in, is by triggering a nuclear war. And it's easy to understand why he thinks that way. As the climate crisis plays out over the next 20, 30 years, and it will, no matter what we do to try to limit the ultimate damage, things are going to get worse in the next couple of decades. As that happens, large portions of the planet are going to find themselves literally unable to support the human population. And this is going to trigger conflict within countries as people fight over scarce resources of food and water. It's going to trigger conflict between countries as they fight over scarce resources of food and water. It's going to trigger migration on a scale that we've never seen in human history. We have all witnessed how the influx of maybe 5 or 10 million immigrants into the United States over the last decade has upended the political order here in this country. The estimates about climate refugees are there will be between 50 and 150 million people forced to leave where they're currently living because the land can no longer support them. And this is going to cause tremendous instability across the planet. And if, as that plays out, nuclear weapons are still on the table, the chance of their being used is going to rise dramatically. And the final factor that we need to be cognizant of is the rapid advances in cyber technology, which increase the danger of cyber terrorism, increase the danger of a cyber accident-induced accidental nuclear war. The ultimate expression of the danger here is the plan, which is denied but which is undoubtedly real, to mate our command and control systems in other countries as well with artificial intelligence, with all the potential that has for totally unintended consequences. So for all these reasons, we need to understand that nuclear war is a real threat. It really can happen, and it can happen very soon. And in fact, if the path we're headed on right now is not a good one. So given that, I think it's really important for us to remind ourselves what's going to happen if there is a nuclear war, because just as we forgot about the whole danger, people of my generation have largely forgotten what nuclear war would look like, and young people really have never been taught this. I mean, the level of ignorance is a charged word. The lack of information that young people have about nuclear war is just astonishing. Smart, well-educated young people, college students, just don't know about this stuff. So let me run through a little bit just to put this back in our minds. I want to start by describing what a modern attack on a city would look like. A lot of us, especially last year on the 80th anniversary, saw many images of Hiroshima and Nagasaki after the atomic bombing. And these images were very powerful, and they were very powerful warnings to us about the damage that nuclear weapons can cause. But the main thing that we need to understand about Hiroshima and Nagasaki is that they do not begin to prepare us for what a modern nuclear war would look like. The Hiroshima bomb had the explosive force of 15 kilotons, 15,000 tons of TNT. It was an enormous explosion. But most of the weapons in the US and Russian arsenal today are between 100 and 800 kilotons. That is to say, they are 6 to 50 times more powerful than the bomb that destroyed Hiroshima. And if there is a war between the United States and Russia, or between the United States and China, it's not going to be one bomb on one city. It's going to be many bombs on many cities. We don't know the exact targeting strategy of any of these countries, but the best estimate that we have is that a major target city, New York or Moscow or Beijing, Washington, London, would be targeted with 5, 10, maybe 15 or even 20 nuclear warheads, each of which are 6 to 50 times more powerful than the Hiroshima bomb. Now, to get an idea of what that would look like, I want to use a model because it's very hard to envision, 15 explosions going off all at once. And I'm going to use the model of one very large explosion, 20 megatons, 20 million tons of TNT. The megatonnage, the explosive force in this model, is somewhat greater than we would expect to hit even a city like New York or Moscow. The destruction I'm going to describe to you, though, however, it's an underestimate because we cause more damage by using many smaller warheads spread over the area you're trying to destroy, which is why we've changed our arsenal and no longer have 20 megaton weapons, but instead have many of the somewhat smaller bombs. But the model, even though it is an underestimate, it puts us in the right ballpark. It gives us a sense of what we're talking about. Within 1,000th of a second of the detonation of this bomb, a fireball would form, reaching out for 2 miles in every direction, 4 miles across. Within this entire area, everything would be vaporized. The buildings, the trees, the people, the upper level of the earth itself would disappear. To a distance of 4 miles in every direction, the explosion would generate winds greater than 600 miles per hour. Mechanical forces of that magnitude can destroy anything that we can build. To a distance of 6 miles in every direction, the heat would be so intense that automobiles would melt. And to a distance of 16 miles in every direction, the heat would still be so intense that everything flammable would burn. Paper, cloth, wood, plastic, gasoline, heating oil, it would all ignite. Hundreds of thousands of fires, which over the next half hour would coalesce into a giant firestorm, 32 miles across, covering over 800 square miles. Within this entire area, the temperature would rise to 1,400 degrees Fahrenheit. All of the oxygen would be consumed, and every living thing would die. In the case of New York or Moscow or Beijing, they're all about the same size. We're talking about 12 to 15, maybe 18 million people dead in a half an hour. And if this were part of a large-scale war involving any of these 3 countries, this kind of destruction would take place at every major city in all of them. And if NATO were involved, most of the great cities in Europe and Canada as well. All told, the death toll on that first afternoon would probably be between 200 and 400 million people. And those who survived in the countries that fought this war would find themselves in a landscape which is just unimaginable to us. None of the things that we require, that we depend on to keep ourselves alive would be available. There'd be no electric grid, no cell phones, no internet, no food distribution system, no public health system, no system of law and order, no banking system. And in the months following this initial attack, most of the people in the countries which fought this war, who survived the first day, would also die. They would die from epidemic disease, from starvation, from radiation poisoning, from exposure to the elements. But even this is just part of the story. I've only been talking about the countries that fight the war. A war on this scale would be a disaster for the entire planet. If the United States and Russia go to war today with just the arsenals which they currently have deployed, none of the weapons that are in storage, and none of the weapons that they may be about to build, the fires caused by that war would loft 150 million tons of black carbon, soot, into the upper atmosphere, blocking out the sun and dropping temperatures across the entire planet, an average of 18 degrees Fahrenheit. In the interior regions of North America and Eurasia, the temperatures would drop 45 to 50 degrees Fahrenheit. This is colder than Earth has been at any time since the coldest moment of the last ice age 18,000 years ago. And under these conditions, most of the ecosystems which have evolved since the end of that ice age would collapse. Food production across the planet would essentially stop. And according to a study that was published in the journal Nature Food in the summer of 2022, in the first 2 years following this war, 3/4 of the human race, 6 billion people, would starve to death. The study only looked at the first 2 years. The famine would continue beyond that, and we do not know what the ultimate death toll would be. It is possible under these conditions that we would become extinct as a species. That same study also showed that a much smaller war, as might take place between India and Pakistan, involving just 250 100-kiloton warheads. They have about 350 warheads in their combined arsenals today, but 250 100-kiloton warheads would cause enough global climate disruption also to trigger a global famine. It wouldn't be quite as severe, but it would be bad enough to kill 2 billion people in the first 2 years, including 130 million people here in the United States. And this is what we dodged last May when India and Pakistan went to war. So the final thing that we need to know about the danger is that we are not made safe by the policies which are in place today. We have all been taught to think that somehow or other there's a stability in the system, mutually assured destruction, deterrence. They keep the ship on an even keel. It's not true. It's a myth. We know of at least 6 occasions when we have come within minutes of the kind of nuclear war I just described. And we are not here today because we knew what we were doing during the nuclear weapons era, during the last 80 years, because we had wise leaders all the time, and sound military doctrine, and perfect technology that never failed. We're here, according to former Defense Secretary Robert McNamara, because, and I'm quoting him, we lucked out. It was luck that prevented nuclear war. And we have to understand that the current policy of all 9 countries which have nuclear weapons is at heart a hope for continued, permanent, perfect good luck. And this is crazy, as we all know. No one's luck lasts forever, and ours won't either. If we allow these weapons to continue to exist, it is not a question of if. It is only a question of when they are used. So this is the danger that we live with every day, that we allow these weapons to continue to exist. It's the bad news, and there's plenty of it. But there is very important good news too, which is none of this needs to happen. Nuclear weapons are not a force of nature. It is not as though there's an asteroid coming at the planet and there's nothing we can do about it. these weapons are little machines. They're about the size of these chairs here in the front row. We've dismantled 60,000 of them. We know exactly how to dismantle the 12,000 that remain in the world today, and we could do it in 3 or 4 years if we chose to do that. The problem is that the 9 countries which have these weapons don't want to give them up. They really are like the Ring of Power in Lord of the Ring. There's just this addictive quality to having this kind of power. And there's no question, having a nuclear arsenal does make your country strong. It lets you, if you're Russia, invade Ukraine and keep the rest of the world from coming to Ukraine's defense. It lets you, if you're the United States or Israel, attack Iran and know that you have the ultimate trump card to play if the war doesn't go well. It does make you strong to have these weapons, but it doesn't make you safe. And we need to create an understanding of that in the 9 countries which have these weapons, that far from providing safety, these weapons are the greatest threat to their national security and, in fact, to their survival. Now, in 2017, 122 nations came together at the United Nations and adopted the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons. These were countries which did not have nuclear weapons and were basically fed up with the failure of the countries that do have nuclear weapons to honor their legally binding obligations under Article 6 of the Non-Proliferation Treaty to negotiate the elimination of these arsenals. And they voted 121 to 1 to adopt this treaty. It went into effect in January of 2021 when the 50th nation ratified the treaty. And it now has, I think it's 75 countries that have ratified and another 25 have signed the treaty but haven't ratified yet. It was a landmark development, and it has had a significant impact on the international discourse about nuclear weapons. But the problem is that none of the 9 nuclear armed states and none of those that live under the U.S. nuclear umbrella in NATO, South Korea, Australia, and Japan have signed on to this treaty. And so the challenge before the world today is figuring out how to change the policy of those 9 countries. And I think it's a responsibility that falls particularly here on us in the United States because of the 9 nuclear states. We have the 2nd largest arsenal, and we are one of 3, possibly 4 countries amongst the nuclear 9 where there really is an open, still, and democratic society where we can play a role in government policy. Recognizing that, in the summer and fall of 2017, right after the treaty was adopted, we began something here in the United States called the Back from the Brink campaign. This campaign was modeled in many ways on the Freeze campaign, if any of you remember that effort from the 1980s, in that we created a prescription of what U.S. nuclear policy ought to be. And we went around the country organizing and trying to get various communities, municipalities, labor unions, civic organizations, faith communities, to endorse this prescription in the belief that if we can get enough people to adopt this, we'll essentially be creating a national consensus which will create the pressure needed to change policy at the national level. The campaign does not call for the United States to disarm unilaterally. It calls for the United States to provide leadership for a worldwide movement for universal disarmament by sitting down now with the other 8 countries which have nuclear weapons and beginning negotiations on the details that are not included in the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons that need to be worked out. The verification mechanisms, the enforcement mechanisms, and the timetable that countries would commit themselves to for dismantling their nuclear arsenals. We also call on the United States to take a number of steps unilaterally, which it can do, that would lessen the danger while these negotiations proceed and would give momentum to the process and demonstrate our good faith and our seriousness and commitment to the elimination of these weapons. The campaign has enjoyed some notable success. There have been resolutions supporting the campaign in 70 cities across the country, including many of the largest, Boston, Philadelphia, Washington, Baltimore, Chicago, Los Angeles, San Francisco, Minneapolis and St. Paul, both, Des Moines, Tucson, Salt Lake City. We have over, at this point, 500 NGO organizations which have endorsed or become partners in this campaign, including, most of the national faith communities, the Episcopal Church, the Presbyterian Church, the Methodist Church, the Congregational Church, the Unitarian Church, the Jewish Reconstructionist Movement, the Islamic Society of North America, Soka Gakkai in the Buddhist community, Pax Christi in the Catholic community. Major environmental groups like the Sierra Club, 350.org. We also have a number of unions which have endorsed the campaign at this point. And there's a student organization which formed a couple of years ago, which now has chapters on 22 campuses, both high school and college, called Students for Nuclear Disarmament. We have resolutions in the U.S. Congress. In the Senate, there are 9 sponsors for S-Res 323, and in the House of Representatives, there are now 55 members of the House who are co-sponsoring H-Res 317. And the number is growing. We've added 6 new sponsors in the House in the last 2 weeks. And we're in conversation with a number of other offices and expect to get additional co-sponsors in the coming month. So there's a lot going on. There's a huge amount that still needs to be done. We are not in a position like the freeze finally achieved in 1982 to bring together 1 million people for a demonstration at the UN. We need to be there. We need to build a movement of that magnitude. And that, I think, is a challenge before all of us today. How do we go from where we are now, a place where we've made some substantial progress, to a much larger movement that can actually bring about the change that's necessary? How can we create a situation where the 2028 election considers the danger of nuclear war as one of the central issues facing the country, something which has not been the case since 1988? I mean, that used to be one of the key questions in a presidential election. Whose finger do you want to have on the button? That needs to be the question again today. I think it might lead to some different results than we've seen in elections over the last period of time. So this is the challenge that we're facing. And it's a big responsibility. Once we know that our entire planet is in danger, and we know that we can do something about it, there's a responsibility to take action. You know, if you see somebody fall down in front of you on the sidewalk, you don't just step over them, you have to help them up. If you know the whole planet's at risk, you have to do what you can to save it. And I think a lot of us feel this as a real burden, which it is. I mean, it's a huge task that we're supposed to do. I think there's several things we need to bear in mind as we look at this problem. First of all, none of us is expected to do this alone. But on the other hand, each one of us is expected, is required to do that part of the job which is ours to do. And, you know, fortunately, we are not starting from scratch. There is a large community now across the country that is engaged in this effort that we can all be part of. And the other way that I think it's important to look at this is every one of us wants to do something good with our life. We want our lives to matter. Those of us who are living today have been given the opportunity literally to save the world. And there is nothing better that anyone can ever do with his or her life. So I encourage you all to become involved in this effort if you're not already. If you are already, to redouble your efforts and rededicate yourself to this. With that spirit in mind, if we all do our part, I think we're going to be successful. I say that not just out of native optimism, but because we did this once before. In 1983, you know, we put missiles in West Germany, Pershing missiles, that had a flight time to Moscow of 6 minutes. The stated reason for doing that was to be able to fight and win a nuclear war in Europe. This was an utterly insane policy. No one is going to win a nuclear war. But it was U.S. policy at the time, and the Russians, the Soviets took that threat very seriously, and we almost went to war twice that year, in September and again in November. Less than 2 years later, in large part in response to the huge movement that we had built in the United States, in Europe, in Japan, even in the Soviet Union, Reagan and Gorbachev sat down together and said nuclear war could never be won and it must never be fought. And they ended the Cold War arms race. And it was such a complete 180-degree reversal in the nuclear policy of each of these countries, excuse me, that when it happened, I think most of us thought it wasn't for real. We thought this was just rhetorical stuff that we were getting thrown at us. But we were wrong. They had really made the decision to end the Cold War arms race, and they almost came to a decision at Reykjavik to eliminate nuclear weapons altogether. So we have done this before. We know we can do it, and that's the challenge before us. I often speak in religious houses of worship. This is a courtroom, but there is a passage in the Hebrew Bible which I always like to quote, in which it is reported that God said, "I have set before you life and death. Therefore choose life so that you and your children can live." That is literally the choice before all of humanity today. And so let us all choose wisely and act with courage and determination so that we can save the world and our children might live. Thank you.
All right, we have time for some questions for the audience. I'll bring the mic around. If you just want to wave me down.
And I'm happy to answer any questions, but also eager to hear your thoughts about what you all can do, what you already are doing, and things of that sort.
Does our university, well, thanks for your talk, Doctor, first. And I would like to know, does our university have a chapter for students of nuclear disarmament? And if not, how can we start one?
Oh, that's a great question. I love that. You don't yet. There's a sign-up sheet here that any students can please sign. And we'll put your name on the National Students for Nuclear Disarmament mailing list. And there'll also be we have a part-time staff person who works with students for nuclear disarmament who will be in touch with anybody who wants to start a chapter here. Most chapters are organized around a specific project, getting a local member of Congress to co-sponsor the resolution, getting a resolution passed by their student government or by the city council in the city that they're living in. A lot of them are also just focused on educational activity because there's this huge need to bring this information to students.
Other questions?
Yeah, there are two sheets. One is students for nuclear disarmament, and the other is for Back from the Brink. And you're welcome to sign on both of them if you want to be involved with both students for nuclear disarmament and the general campaign.
Sir, you mentioned.
Oh, sorry, just one last thing. Sign up, please write carefully. We get these forms back all the time, and no one can read the emails, so we can't be in touch with you. Sorry.
The 12,000 current bombs that need to be disabled. How is that done, and what is done to keep them from being reignited?
Yeah. I don't know the technical details of the process. The general concept is the warheads have a mass of plutonium, usually sometimes highly enriched uranium, which is fissile, which can explode, causing a nuclear explosion, and then can trigger a secondary hydrogen explosion. To dismantle the weapon, what you need to do is take the fissile material and separate it. Take it out of the configuration that it's in, where it can be detonated, and just get the plutonium dispersed enough that you cannot reach a critical mass. And we have done this with, as I mentioned, about 60,000 warheads have been taken apart. The big question is the second part of what you asked. What do you do then to make sure this doesn't get reassembled? And at the moment, the fissile material is just under storage. The treaties that have led to the dismantling of all those warheads have provided for intrusive inspection and verification mechanisms so that we know the Russians have separated their plutonium and kept it apart. They know we've done the same with ours. The stuff is still there. It could be reassembled. And so in the future, what would need to happen, especially if we're going to go to zero, is all this fissile material is going to have to be put under international control. There are ways of treating it that make it much harder to reassemble into a nuclear warhead. Most of the conversations have talked about a process called vitrification, where it's ground up into small pieces, and then the pieces are embedded in a ceramic so that it's hard to extract them again and put them back together. But I think we have to acknowledge we've created a gigantic problem by creating all this highly enriched uranium and plutonium in the first place. We really don't know what to do with it in the long term. And long term is the operative word here. In the case of plutonium, this stuff remains a serious carcinogen for something between 250 and 480,000 years. And we are generating enormous quantities of this and other radioactive waste in the process of building our weapons, in the process of running our nuclear power plants. And we do not know, after 80 years into the nuclear weapons era, what to do with all this stuff. We're just basically dumping this on future generations and telling them it's going to be your problem. And I think it's one of the most immoral aspects of this whole enterprise. Even if we don't blow ourselves up, hopefully, we've created this incredible toxic legacy for which there is, at this point, no known solution. But we can get it out of get plutonium and highly enriched uranium out of the most dangerous configuration, which is shaped into a warhead that can explode. We do know how to do that.
Last question. The 9 countries that have nuclear weapons, does that include Iran?
No. The 9 countries are going size from their largest to the smallest in terms of their arsenal. Russia, the United States, China, France, the UK, India, Pakistan, Israel, North Korea. It does not include Iran, which, so far as everyone knows, does not have nuclear weapons yet, although from my perspective, they clearly were pursuing the ability to build these weapons. They were enriching uranium to 60%. There is no legitimate peaceful reason for enriching uranium to 60%. And even if they had not made the decision to build the weapons, they were clearly trying to create the conditions where they could do that. And given that they say they weren't interested in actually building the weapons, it just seems like a bizarrely provocative thing to have done to enrich to this level.
There's a very strong Texas connection that I think a lot of folks aren't aware of. The Camtex plant, which is right outside of Amarillo. And in the early 80s, it was assembling all nuclear warheads. And then it moved into disassembly. And it still is doing some of that, but there's kind of a responsibility, if you will, I think, because we used to have signs in the early 80s, Camtex, where the end of the world begins. And so Texas PSR, got folks here, Physicians for Social Responsibility, one of the organizations that you received a Nobel Peace Prize for, is starting, it has assisted in something called 10, Texans Ending Nuclear Dangers, and it has been designated a hub. Back from the Brink is doing regional hubs. If you go to the Back from the Brink preventnuclearwar.org, you'll see the hubs, and now Texas has a hub, and it's a coalition of different groups around the state, and we're having a lunch tomorrow the Rappaport Center is having lunch tomorrow for students over at, where is that?
Building.
At noon, free food, invite your friends, and we'd love to see some friends there and talk about what y'all are interested in doing here.
Hi, thanks for speaking with us today.
Sure.
My question is about something you mentioned. A lot of young people seem to have a lack of awareness or interest, and especially as we get further temporally from Hiroshima and Nagasaki, it seems like the importance of disarmament is getting lost culturally. In your advocacy, what do you think is the strongest way we could kind of redouble our efforts or interests, especially amongst younger generations?
In many ways, that's a $64,000 question. How do we get this out to young people? You said a lack of awareness and interest. I think definitely a lack of awareness. I don't think it's a lack of interest. When we talk to young people, students, about this, they get very interested. And there's this large movement of students around the climate crisis. These students all get that there are existential threats to human civilization. And it's a relatively short leap from that understanding to the understanding that there are actually 2 existential threats. The problem is reaching that audience in the first place to get them to listen. If you put up a sign on a college campus that there's going to be a talk for students about nuclear war, you don't get a very large audience. Of the people who do come, a very high proportion do want to join Students for Nuclear Disarmament. They react to it the same way they react to the climate crisis. So it really becomes a question of how do you create the audience. And obviously, a lot of people who have been involved in building Back from the Brink are people of, not all as old as me, but they're of my generation. not nimble at all in social media, which is the way that a lot of young people get their information. And there's a major focus about that. Back from the Brink has now hired a communications team. We have a wonderful person working for us based in Los Angeles doing our social media. But that's the kind of area that I think we really need to figure out. How do we get out to that broader audience? And that's largely what Students of Nuclear Disarmament is focusing on, how to reach out to other students and get them to understand that this problem exists. I think once we get that message out more broadly, I'm quite comfortable from what I've seen that there will be a movement that follows very soon after that.
A couple comments. I literally came here from a discussion of the existential risk of AI. That's getting a lot of attention. That's good, but I wish this would get as much as that, if not more. We have not, US, Soviet Union, Russia, and China, detonated a nuclear weapon since the early 1980s.
90s.
1990s, yeah. And there is an effort now to test another device. I wish more attention was paid to that to stop that from reigniting the testing of nuclear weapons. I jokingly, only half jokingly, suggest we start a movement that says any world leader that detonates a nuclear weapon is permanently barred from getting the Nobel Peace Prize. And the third thing is, right after that, we are going to be spending some unbelievable amount of money to rebuild our current nuclear weapons, something in the order of $1 trillion. I wish more attention could be paid to stopping that from happening and just let the things slowly decay.
Yeah, there's several really good points there. First of all, on the question of testing, it would be absolutely insane for the United States to assume nuclear testing. We've done more tests than any other country. We've acquired more information from those tests than any other country, and we have more sophisticated computers to generate further information without doing testing than any other country. If we start testing, they're all going to start testing, and it's just going to really destabilize the whole situation and feed the arms race, which is now developing since the end of the New START Treaty. There is a push in the United States. The Heritage Fund, Project 2025, explicitly called for the resumption of testing. It also called for the expansion of the U.S. nuclear arsenal. The rationale for this is hard to even imagine. We have right now, the United States, about 4,000 nuclear warheads. Many of them are in storage. 1,700 of them about are deployed. War between India and Pakistan with 250 warheads destroys human civilization and kills a third of our population. What are we talking about? What in the world would we expect to gain by building more of these warheads? We already have the ability to destroy the entire world. And part of the problem is that this whole conversation is driven, well, some of it's driven just by greed on the part of the arms manufacturers, but among those who are not moving from that perspective, the conversation, if you listen to them talking, it's like they're playing three-dimensional chess. It's all based in game theory, and it's all totally divorced from the real world, from what actually happens when the weapons get used. When we, in the 1980s, when we got to 30,000 warheads in our arsenal and 30,000 warheads in the Soviet arsenal, McNamara was saying then that if you could blow up 20 cities, that would be an adequate deterrent. No country would willingly enter into a conflict in which they knew that their 20 largest cities were going to get obliterated. 20. We had 30,000 warheads. Part of the whole rationale behind the work that I've done as a physician in Physicians for Social Responsibility and International Physicians Prevention of Nuclear War is to try to refocus that conversation on the actual consequences, the medical consequences, what the Red Cross calls the humanitarian impact. What is going to happen when these weapons are used? And what we found, it was really quite interesting in the negotiation for the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons. Those negotiations began in the usual manner with a lot of abstract, nuclear game theory. When we were able to focus on what was going to happen, and the new data at that point just coming out was about nuclear famine, particularly nuclear famine related to limited nuclear war. When we were able to refocus the conversation on that, on the actual consequences, the whole conversation changed. the obvious next thing that you think about is how do we get rid of these things, not how many more do we build. And, in large measure, I think that's why I hit people over the head with this horrible description of what's going to happen if there's a nuclear war. That's what we need to understand. This is what's going to happen. And I think to the extent that we understand that, we're going to do something about it. And it's difficult because, there's a question of knowing something and there's a question of believing that something can actually happen. I talk about this all the time. I mean, I talk about this occasionally in my sleep. My wife has to wake me up. I know this is what's going to happen, and I know that it can happen, and I know how bad it's going to be. There's a big part of me that doesn't believe it. I go about my life as though this were not the case. And that's good, because otherwise you go crazy. But we need to figure out the balance somehow between, putting this, how to compartmentalize this so we think about it enough to let it motivate us to do the things we need to do and not so much that we get overwhelmed by it. That was a very long ramble in response to your comments, but thank you for them. Oh, sorry, the budget thing. Just also, two things about that. One is the actual figure, I think, is the estimate is between $1.7 and $2 trillion that we will spend just enhancing the current arsenal. That does not include if we decide to build up. And part of the Heritage Foundation recommendation is that the U.S. needs to have an arsenal that is not only matches the size of the Russian arsenal, but matches the size of the Russian and Chinese arsenals combined. So if we do that, of course, the Russians will now need an arsenal that matches the size of our newly enlarged arsenal. And you just get into this spiral. So the $1.7 to $2 trillion figure may be quite conservative if we get into that kind of an arms race. The other great drain on the economy is going to be the Golden Dome. The conservative American Enterprise Institute has estimated that the Golden Dome will cost $3.6 trillion and it will not be effective. We will be releasing, back from the brink, IPPNW and PSR, the three together, a report in the next few weeks that looks at this question: will the Golden Dome protect us? We're not releasing it publicly yet, but for your information, we looked at a scenario where we construct a Golden Dome that's 80% effective, which is way optimistic. We're not going to get to that level of effectiveness. But we describe this as a best-case scenario to show how even the best-case scenario doesn't really help. 80% effective. That means that the Russians, without building another weapon, without taking any of their weapons out of storage, just by retargeting the weapons they already have deployed, would be able to target the 132 largest population centers in the United States with a 95% probability of destroying any one of them. And within the zone of complete destruction in those 132 population centers, there are 75 million people living. So that's what we would get for $3.6 trillion, a system that leaves the 132 largest cities in the country and 75 million people vulnerable to attack. And, they're going to go for this because Raytheon, the companies that are going to make this, they're just salivating over all this money that's going to be coming their way. And that is going to have to get stopped. But I think in order to stop that, we're going to have to get people to understand that the whole nuclear enterprise needs to go away. As long as people think that nuclear weapons make us safe, as long as they think that deterrence kind of works, then they're going to be willing to spend these obscene amounts of money to be safe. As soon as they understand that we can spend all this money and we're still all going to die if there's a nuclear war and we're increasing the chances we're going to have one, that's when we're going to be able to actually cut the budget, I think, and end some of these very, very wasteful programs. Sorry.
Yeah, Dr. Helfand, thank you so much for the talk. I want to ask two questions. I am an international Russian student, so I'm very invested in what you do, and I do my research on nuclear imagination specifically. So I have a question about young generation, because you said specifically that young generation is not that fully aware. What I figured out that we are not just fully aware, we're fully saturated with that, because I was born when the Fallout video game was happening. Bikini Bottom was on the screen, so it's not just a funny coincidental name for the cartoon. So all these shows like Silo, Oppenheimer movie with Christopher Nolan. So I'm doing research on how we imagine and speculate and aestheticize this. My question is what does it do to us that actually we are producing a lot of apocalyptic, post-apocalyptic visuals for a public audience, and how does it affect us?
I think it depends what the context is. You know, when we produced, ABC produced The Day After in the 1980s, at a time when people understood that nuclear war could really happen, it had a huge impact in the way we would hope. It mobilized people and it put great pressure on the government to do something. I think the post-apocalyptic stuff that gets produced today is produced in the setting where people don't think this is actually going to happen. And that's what the difference is. And what you're suggesting, I think, may be true, that in some ways it's numbing people rather than motivating them. We need to produce this stuff in a way that makes it clear this is not fiction that we're talking about. In the recent Netflix movie, House of Dynamite, I think was really quite good. And it was good because people, I think it did come across this actually could happen. Yeah, that part of it is really important. And it's interesting because even though people are seeing all this apocalyptic literature, animations, whatever, young people really don't know what the real world situation is. You know, Jonathan Schell, who wrote the book The Fate of the Earth, used to teach a webinar at Wesleyan about nuclear weapons. And Wesleyan's a top, liberal arts college. The kids are very bright, and they had signed up to go to this seminar on nuclear weapons. On the first day of the seminar every year, he would hand out a piece of paper to everybody in the room and ask them to write down how many nuclear weapons do you think there are in the world. And the answers he got every year ranged from 0 to 200, at a time back then when there were 20,000. I've done that somewhat myself when I've talked to college students, and I get basically the same answers. People think there are none, think that maybe someone's going to build one, they think maybe there are 100. They really don't understand what the actual situation is. And that is what we have to teach them.
And the second question about this survivalism, because we've been noticing a lot about like the people in the bunkers, the CEOs building their all like the culture of like survival. So what do you think is that? Is it just like psychological reaction, some kind of like an idea that we would like, they still think that it would happen, but we will survive? What that movement is?
Well, yeah, there's a lot of wishful thinking going on here that is divorced from reality. People, they want to know which, there have been some articles recently in I think the USA Today, which cities are the safest cities to be in the United States. The answer is none. And that wasn't the answer they provided. They tried to show you where you were least likely to get hit by a bomb and didn't discuss the fact that you're going to starve to death in the nuclear famine that followed. In the 80s, this was pushed very hard by the government. So we may see this start to emerge again. This civil defense idea. We had these bizarre plans where we were going to mass relocate everybody out of the cities in 24 hours. We all know what that's like at rush hour. We were told that if there was a nuclear war, this was actually a U.S. government publication. You were supposed to take a door off the hinges, lean it against the side of your house, cover it with dirt, and then climb under the door, and that was going to protect you from the radiation. And the head of civil defense at the time actually said, with enough shovels, we're all going to survive. And so there's a lot of wishful thinking, and that has to be countered with reality.
So you can probably tell by looking that I'm from the freeze generation. In fact, I was the director of the Texas Freeze campaign back in the 80s. I've always wondered why the interest fell away. It does seem to be rejuvenating. I'm a part of a half dozen different organizations just here in the Southwest. But I've always wondered about the intellectual digression. We were aware in the 80s. Do you have any speculation as to what happened and why? And obviously that's moving towards how do we revitalize that intellectual awareness?
I think it's understandable in a way. We were all scared to death in the 80s. We thought we were going to die in a nuclear war. And very much unexpectedly, the Cold War ended. The Berlin Wall came down. Reagan and Gorbachev were buddies. And I remember the fall of '89 in particular, when the wall came down, going through my files about nuclear stuff and throwing out most of it because I thought the danger had passed. I saved some stuff deliberately so I could show my kids what I'd been doing while they were growing up in the 80s, and I wasn't being as attentive a dad as I should have been. But I think that just the whole world felt this huge wave of relief. And we just all kind of collectively decided we don't have to worry about this anymore, and we're not going to worry about this anymore. Because there has been evidence all along that we should be worrying about it. But we just really didn't want to get back into that mindset because it was really unpleasant to be worrying about nuclear war all the time. I think that's what happened. And I think the reason why we're able to start rebuilding an anti-nuclear movement today is because it's just hard to maintain that level of denial in the face of everything that's happening. You know, when Putin is threatening on a regular basis to use nuclear weapons in Ukraine, or the U.S. and Israel bomb with, you know, the Iranian nuclear facilities, or India and Pakistan almost go to war, it's just kind of hard to maintain the denial. But it's still there. And that's really, I think we need to understand that's a lot of our task, is helping people get beyond that denial.
The last one.
Yeah, I was on this campus around 1978 through 83, and first thing is we didn't start from nothing. It felt like almost nothing because older people were comparing us to the Vietnam generation. So we had to start with 10s and 20s and maybe 100s and start to grow and not have that comparison to some imagined good old days. We had to raise the salience of the issue, and we didn't start from nothing. The anti-nuclear power movement helped give a launch pad to the anti-nuclear weapons movement. And then the people who were most directly affected and worried were Europeans. They had marched by the millions against the Pershing forward base 6-minute window. They didn't want to be blown up because of us, where they had no say. So they had a more direct stake in it. But we got inspired. That traveled over the Atlantic, and we got inspired. And that's how I think we were able to have 1 million strong in '82 at the UN Special Session on Disarmament. And again, we had a context. We had the UN meeting about this. So I would just say, you know, things don't spring out of nothing. And we have to look for our opportunities and how to make connections with perhaps other causes, so-called. It's really all the same thing in my mind. Climate, war, and then the nuclear threat. So I don't know, not really a question there, but I just wanted to say, even the nuclear weapons freeze, I do have a prelude to a question. Even the nuclear weapons freeze was an intermediate goal. It said, if both sides agree, we ought to stop building more. It didn't say get rid of them all.
That's right.
And so that's where I'm thinking is like, if we have to walk before we can run, maybe restart the START treaty, put back the ABM treaty. I don't know what the other less drastic, but do you guys have a blueprint? Do you have something besides we all ought to get together and sing Kumbaya and get rid of nuclear weapons tomorrow? Do you have any intermediate goals in your platform?
Yes and no. Back from the Brink calls for a number of intermediate steps. It calls for the United States to adopt a no first use policy. It calls for the United States to take our weapons off hair trigger alert. It calls for the United States to end unchecked presidential authority to launch nuclear weapons, and it calls for the United States to abandon the plan to spend $1.7 trillion. But I'll tell you something, I don't think we're going to get any of those things unless we win the broader debate, which is, do we want to have these weapons at all? In the 80s, we didn't, the freeze movement was not for abolition because no one thought we could figure out how to do that. There was no confidence that we would be able to eliminate weapons in a way that we could verify. They think that, but it's no longer. But it's no longer true. We've since then we've had decades, literally, of experience on what verification regimens need to look like. We have much more sophisticated national technical means for verifying if countries are doing what they need to do, and so that objection to going for abolition in the 80s, I think has gone away. I think that I think we need to go for the wall on this one. We really need to be swinging for the wall. I think that we're much more likely to get the intermediate steps if we convince people that the weapons need to go all together. As long as people think that deterrence works, that nuclear weapons provide security, it's always going to be hard to get them to do anything which can be shown, which can be argued to be weakening deterrence. And we have been trying for more than a decade to get a no first use policy, and trying for that amount of time to do something to check unlimited presidential authority. And it always founders on those kinds of arguments, but we need the nuclear deterrent. This will undermine it. So I think we put those forward as an integral part of what Back from the Brink is calling for, but we say those are intermediate steps that can be taken as the negotiations are taking place. And the critical thing that needs to take place is for the United States to decide that we actually want to get rid of our nuclear arsenal, and we're going to make this not some distant 80 years in the future aspirational goal, but something that we're actively working for today. And, you know, it is possible the United States could make that decision, could go to the Russians and Chinese and have them say, no, we're not going to do it. But I don't think we should assume that, you know, a priori, because we've never really tried that before. You hear occasionally that we keep reaching out to the Chinese and they won't negotiate with us. Well, they won't negotiate with us because we're not talking about getting down to 600 warheads like they have. We're talking about them stopping and us keeping where we are. And of course, they're not going to talk to us about that, although they should, but they won't. So I do think that our path forward really needs to be very clearly directed towards the abolition. I also think, by the way, that the time frame for this is quite short. Another reason not to go for intermediate steps alone. 250 warheads in South Asia destroys human civilization. I don't know how many times they're going to dodge that bullet again. And this is something over which we have in the United States, have no direct control unless we figure out how to engage with India and Pakistan to get rid of their nuclear arsenal too. And so we really need, with great urgency, to be attending to that, because last May, that could have been the end of the game. And the conditions which led to that mini-war have not in any way been resolved. It could happen again tonight.
All right. I'm not sure I want to end on that.
I don't want to end on that.
Did you want to do a hope thing?
Yeah.
No, you've done that, which I very much appreciate, and know that folks are engaged and thinking about how to move forward in a variety of ways. So I want to thank you for this talk and for all the work that you do. And I hope a third Nobel Peace Prize is coming your way, because we're going to achieve all of this.
When Gorbachev and Reagan got the Nobel Peace Prize in 1985, the statement that we issued said, the Peace Prize, when IPPNW got it in 1985, the statement that we issued said, the Nobel Prize we are looking forward to is the one that will be awarded to Gorbachev and Reagan when they end the Cold War arms race. And that's the one we're looking forward to today. No matter who it is that gets it, if they get rid of nuclear weapons, they deserve the prize.
There, maybe that's all he needs. So thank you so much.
The sign-up sheets. Who has the sign-up sheets? Okay, just want to make sure we've got them. Okay,
and then
great.
just a reminder of the student meeting tomorrow at 12 o'clock in the Glickman Conference Center. And lunch, free lunch. And thanks for signing the sheets. And if somebody wanted to but didn't get them, they are back there.
Oh, one last thing I could say, to end things on a more positive note. It's been mentioned that IPPNW and ICAN both won the Nobel Peace Prize. This is the 1985 Nobel Peace Prize, which I bring to talks, especially when I'm speaking on campuses, because students in particular often like to come up and get selfies with it. But even if you're not a student, if you'd like to come up and get a selfie with it, you're more than welcome to.